I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to get started here in just a little bit. Thank you for joining in. We'll just give it a couple more minutes here for the rest of the audience to come in. If you're just joining us, we'll get started here in just a minute. We're waiting for the rest of the audience to get here. Okay, I think we'll get started here. My name is Kristin Dziczek. I'm the Vice President of the Center for Automotive Research, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be killing unicorns. And it's a pretty interesting set of presentation that we have, and I hope a very engaging conversation. As always with our webinars at the Center for Automotive Research, There will be a recording of the webinar, and any of the presentations will be available on our website, as well as all past webinars that we've conducted and any presentations that were available from those. You can go to cargroup.org/webinars to see what we've presented in the past. Some of it is, still very timely information, and I highly recommend you to check that out if you haven't already. And if this is your first webinar, welcome to the Center for Automotive Research. We've been doing these on a roughly weekly basis to try to get some information out to our affiliate members, our partners in the communities, and beyond. Please consider donating to the Center for Automotive Research. We're a nonprofit organization, and it will help support our unfunded COVID-19 research, and you can do that at cargroup.org. We are also known for our big event once a year, the Traverse City, usually management briefing seminars. This year, they are going to be held virtually, August 4th through 5th. And registration is now open also at cargroup.org, and the registration fees are very much reduced, and the content there is just amazing. So we've been able to keep many of our speakers and get some really great speakers who otherwise might not have been able to travel to Traverse City in the past. So I think we've got a really good lineup for you August 4th and 5th. And check it out if you have been to MBS before. It'll be a little bit different. We are using a virtual conference platform, so it's not just like sitting in front of another Zoom or webinar, but we are looking at ways to recreate some of that, the feel of MBS in this virtual arena, and potentially, depending on where we are with the disease by then, we may have some other aligned events alongside the virtual events. So please check it out and check out our agenda there and see if there's some things in there that you might be interested in. Today, we're going to hear from Doug Betts, President of the Automotive Division at J.D. Power and Associates, and Matthew Racho, who's the Managing Director of Configuration and Analytics at J.D. Power and Associates. This is going to be a very timely presentation on configuration complexity. I remember when we moved to package or option packages in ordering our vehicles or in configuring vehicles. And earlier this week, I haven't bought a car in 10 years or so, but I visited one of the automakers' build your vehicle sites just to see how much complexity I could conjure up. And I was met with the choice of whether I wanted a front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. There were 4 different trim levels, 2 engines and 2 transmissions. And so far, we've got 12 different configurations. There's a whole bunch of colors, which we're not going to count, interior and exterior. There were 9 different option packages, 3 wheel choices outside of the option packages, 13 exterior options, steps and roof racks and things like that, 2 different radios, 24 interior options, 4 added safety options, and 77 dealer installed options. I didn't get out my calculator and do all the factorials, but that's a heck of a lot of choice and a lot of variation and complexity for the automakers, suppliers, and dealers to manage. And right now, we're in an environment where we're lowering costs and trying to increase efficiency, and that's a significant focus as the assembly and supplier plants are ramping up. This is really going to be a very critical thing. A week ago, Wednesday, I tuned into the weekly J.D. Power briefing, and I was really shocked by this part of their presentation that our guests are going to show us today, a little bit more than what they showed last week, but I'll give you a little preview. J.D. Power found that for the retail side of the market, about 13.6 million retail sales in 2019, there were over 600,000 different vehicle configurations, and that's a lot. And it might be worth it if everyone gets exactly the vehicle they want and they're willing to pay those premiums for those extra features that they get. I don't know about you, but I have a roof rack on my car that I never use because it was on the car when I got it, and I really didn't want to pay extra for a roof rack, but that's how we end up with folks who don't value all of the options that are configured in the vehicle they may get. Most people in the US are buying from dealer inventory, and so they end up with one of these vehicles that has low volume in the configuration, not by choice, but by default. And that means they're often not willing to pay for those options that are available to them. This JD Power data that this presentation is based on shows that just 2% of vehicle configurations make up nearly 3/4 of all retail light vehicle sales. And those vehicles stay on lots longer. The vehicles that aren't that are more unicorn stay on the lots longer and have much lower margins. Now, if I were a supplier and I were in your shoes, I would want to try to avoid being on those products and get on the high volume, the 2% configurations as much as you could. And if I'm an automaker, I sure as heck would want to eliminate a lot of that configuration complexity. The 98% of vehicle variants that I'm producing without making much of a profit for either my company or my dealers. And so here to help us understand this vehicle, how the industry got here and what it could mean to suppliers and dealers as we move forward through this very tight cash crunch environment are, again, Doug Betts, the president of the Automotive Division, and Matthew Racho, who's the Managing Director of Configuration Analytics. So gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me here today. Why don't you kick us off by showing the data that I saw last week and a little bit more, and we can get into some of the specifics. So thank you.
All right. So this is Doug Betts. So I'll walk through the first part of this, and there's a slide we added at the end that Matthew's going to talk about that we didn't talk to at our own webinar last week. First, let me just give you a little background on this data that we have. It's a pretty recent development. So we have had something we call PIN for, I guess, about 8 or 9 years. Matthew knows the history better than I do, and it was something that the founder of JD Power, Dave Power, pursued. I think it took him 8 or 9 years to actually get this data. It was sort of a hammer and tongs, dealer by dealer struggle to be able to put this data set together. But PIN really is a direct access to vehicle transaction information. So we get a lot of data about actual vehicles that were sold. Roughly, I think it's 43% of the market for new and used vehicles sold by franchise dealers, and a lot of data so that in effect we can tease out what people paid for a car. And also another critical factor is how many days that car that they bought sat on the lot before they bought it. So if you think about what people paid for a car and how many days it was there before somebody bought it, those two things are really the performance of that vehicle. How commercially desirable it was. It can be assumed to be reflected by how quickly somebody snapped it up and how much they paid for it. Makes total sense. The data set that we recently put together over last year was a precise understanding VIN number by VIN number, and we have roughly 125 million VINs in our database now. It's going back 10 years. We know exactly what equipment is on those cars, and if you didn't know, the only entities that know what is on the car by VIN number typically are the OEMs themselves, but we've managed to put this data set together. So if you take those two things and put them together, you can look at a configuration and see how many of those there are that are the same. And then you can look at, with our PIN data, you can look at the performance in the market, and you can make some judgments, which is what we're gonna look at next. So if I go to the first slide, which is beeping at me, there we go. So you'll have to put your phones down and not try to do two things at once for a couple of slides here to understand this. This is taking a particular model, which I won't name, and looking at it on a national basis and identifying each of the unique configurations, meaning that the equipment that is on that car is unique to some other version of the car. Maybe just one option is different or whatever. We're not calling different colors unique. So this would blow up if you added whatever the nine different colors exterior and 3 different interior colors. Then there'd be a lot more dots on here. But this is like physically different in terms of the options that are on the cars. And then we add the PIN data to that, and we look at what did on the left, the y-axis, what did the dealer make on that transaction. And on the x-axis, how many days to turn, how many days was that vehicle on the lot before somebody bought it. So, you know, if you're in the upper left-hand quadrant, that means you sold for a reasonable profit for the dealer, and you sold quicker than the average for this vehicle. The center of the XY dotted lines is the average for this vehicle, which is 80 days on the lot and only making $100 for the dealer up front on that vehicle. We're not counting the money that the dealer may have made on F&I stuff, financing and extended warranties or whatever other products they might have added during the final selling process. So you can see there's a number of vehicles that are slow to turn. You know, to the right of the 80 days, they're worse than the average, and 80 days is pretty long. And you can see the ones that are sort of the worst performing are in that lower right quadrant, where they're slow to turn compared to the average, and they're also sold at a loss. So you can imagine, you know, the way I visualize it is a lot of people that went on dealer lots looked at these ones that are in the lower right quadrant and said, you know, that's not the one that I want. You know, it's missing something, or it has, you know, has too much. That's something I don't want to pay for. And they walked past it and they bought a different one. So the next slide is also really, you know, unfortunately, it's hard to understand. We did the best we could. It's a kind of a complicated subject. So let me walk you through this. Sticking with our same vehicle from the previous page, we categorized those configurations, those dots that had less than 50 sold, you know, and this is 2020 model year data. So far this year, 88% of the total configurations that have been sold for Model A have only sold less than 50 copies of each. So you can see that we're really, you know, Model A is really selling a bunch of rare vehicles. I mean, I don't think the buyers know that they have such a rare configuration. They should probably not drive them and store them in a barn somewhere. But, you know, that's just sort of how it's playing out for Model A based on the configurations that they're offering and the way that they're being, you know, put on the lot across the country. So, you know, if we talk about the numbers related to the industry and not just Model A, 98% of all configurations across the industry sell less than 50 units each, again, excluding color. And that only totals up to 26% of the total sales. So a lot of work is done. I mean, and the systems that manage this were expensive to create, to be able to manage the complexity of building all of these different versions. And that was all done just to provide, you know, extreme complexity for 26% of the total sales. So, you know, we are the interesting thing about the US market, which is different than some of the other markets, is we are a sell from stock market. And we're, you know, most of us probably on the call are from this market, so we're sort of used to that. You decide you want a car, and you go down and you see what they've got on a lot for your local dealer. You may nowadays you may have built a version online, and the OEM site would allow you a lot of flexibility to configure a car that is what, you know, has the equipment on it that you want. But the likelihood of you finding that car that you configured on a local lot is pretty low, unless you happen to configure, you know, one that your local dealer agrees with you is the right configuration. In general, in the industry, the dealers are the ones who decide what to order. They buy cars from the OEMs, and then they resell them to their local market. And I think when things were simpler, it may have been easier for the dealer to order because there weren't so many choices. And now with so many choices, it's very difficult for the dealer to be, you know, if Model A, for example, has 1,500 different versions that a dealer could order, there's no way through some sort of a trial and error process that a dealer is going to figure out what really resonates with their customers. They could never work their way through that experiment. All right, so now we'll go back to this now that we have all of that context. And so for Model A, half of the sales are these less than 50 or unicorns, as we've called them. They do not perform better. They're roughly, they have an average performance. So you've done all this work to create something that isn't, if these were the ones that sold in the upper left-hand corner, you'd say, well, maybe it was worth it, but that's not the case. And the cost of these cars that sit on the lot really is the complete cost of it is not accounted for. The industrial cost of being able to deal with this variation.
I found them.
The cost of setting up not just in the assembly plants, but setting up the supplier factories to be able to do line changeovers and so forth in order to support the complexity, is really just considered part of doing business, but not considered, why are we doing it? We're spending all this money and what are we getting for it? And then the cost of these vehicles that are either anywhere to the right of the dotted line, and the vertical dotted line has a cost of carrying the inventory. Every day that a car sits on a dealer's lot, it's roughly ballpark, it's $7 a day for it to sit there. It's taking a spot. It has a carrying cost, and then additionally, there's something called lot rot that happens. Brake rotors rust, paint gets scratched or gets weathered. So do interior parts, and batteries go dead. There's lots of things that either have to be maintained carefully or they end up turning into warranty costs. So a lot of cost associated with not building the cars that get taken away quickly in a build to stock market like ours. So finally, this slide is showing the so far for 2020 the complexity that has been built and sold. We're not even talking about the complexity that has been prepared for, right? This is just what has been ordered and sold so far in 2020. It's actually, I think it was 437,000 so far in 2020. On a track to last year was, I think, 607,000. But if you knew the number that the automakers and the suppliers were prepared to build, if they got ordered, I would guess it would be in the millions, because I know for many vehicles, the starting point engineering doesn't tie down much at all in terms of options and the combinations of options. And even in the example that Kristin gave, I did do a little bit of the math, and if every one of those choices were not limited, it was something like a 3.4 million, just on what she described, not counting the dealer options or the color. So there's a lot of complexity that's engineered, prepared for in manufacturing. A lot of that isn't used, but even what is used is still not getting down to what really the market is looking for. And so, this is what we've been able with this data set to identify as the performance issues that are associated. And I think it does give those of us working in the industry an opportunity to be able to make some more accurate decisions on what to cut. Because my view is, it's kind of like for those of you who are engineers on the call, it's like the second law of thermodynamics. If you don't put energy into reducing complexity, it will grow just naturally. It is randomness, just like entropy. So had to get that in there for the engineers out there. So let me hand over to Matthew, and he'll talk about this last slide, which we could make almost a limitless number of slides with different subjects, but this is an example he's going to go over. Matthew.
Thanks, Doug. So if we switch slides, so we're looking at here our ability to get into the weeds. So looking at one common feature, which is adaptive cruise control, if we click forward, we can start to see what the industry trends are. So over model years, we can see that adaptive cruise control, those big bar charts tell us that the take rates, the mix across the industry has increased from roughly 4% in 2015 to 46% for the 2020 model year. And you'll see a couple lines on that chart as well, a little dotted line, which is the industry average profitability for vehicles, and then a solid line, which is the profitability for the industry level where that feature is actually on that vehicle. And we can see while take rates have increased for this feature, the net benefit, right, above and beyond the segment average or the industry average has narrowed. So vehicles with this feature aren't necessarily getting significantly more gross, but there's just a whole lot more cars selling this feature today. Now, if we click forward, we can see there's some variation across segments. So while the industry is at 46% for the 2020 model year, light duty pickup trucks, though, significantly lower adoption of adaptive cruise control, significantly lower take rates. On average for the 2020 model year, 18% take rate, well below 46% take rate. But we can see on the vehicles with and without this feature, there's definitely a gap. So vehicles that do have adaptive cruise control in this segment earn dealers typically much more profitability. Now, part of that's driven on other factors beyond adaptive cruise control, specifically how these vehicles are bundled together with other trim levels or other content, but we can see that there's a net benefit. Now, outside of this variation across segments, so some segments are going to obviously underperform segment average, as does the pickup segment. Some will overperform. There's also differences across markets. So if we want to look at, if we move forward, an underperforming market. So we'll click on that screen and see Atlanta, for instance. We can see Atlanta has a lower than average take rate for adaptive cruise control. And more importantly, vehicles with that feature actually underperform in terms of dealer profitability. Fast forwarding and moving forward, we can compare that to Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C., significantly higher take rate than Atlanta, 10 percentage point increase. Yet in this market, vehicles with that feature actually perform significantly better in terms of profitability for those dealers. So, one of the issues that product planners or that folks who are actually ordering vehicles are trying to look at is what features are actually growing, what's the difference in terms of take rates across vehicle segments, and how do we handle these differences in markets, and trying to understand that noise. So this really gives an example of what we can look at, and I know Doug gave a good example of us being able to look at hundreds, if not thousands, of views of this data.
Yeah, and I'll just add some additional insight on the subject of product planning, because in a previous life, I sat in countless commercial committee meetings at two different car companies, and the product planning function starts with the plan to bring a new model to market. It may be a major model change of an existing model, or it could be an all new vehicle, and the business case is built on plans, of course for sales volume, but it's very critical option take rates, because profits are made at a higher rate on options in selling cars in our world. And so there are a lot of debates about the penetration of options, existing options, and known technology. Frequently there are ambitions expressed in these meetings about, we've never been able to do this, but with this model, because it's going to have, an Alcantara headliner, we're going to sell a lot more of these high-end options, because people are just going to be influenced by that, or even the new technology that there's a prediction for penetration. And that unfortunately, those discussions were largely hypothetical, sometimes based on discussions with focus group people, like 10 people that are behind what they allegedly think is a mirror, but it's a one-way mirror. And you watch them and you try to predict what, how you're going to sell your 400,000 vehicles based on these 10 people in somewhere in Chicago. And this data that we have now has not been available, and so I think it's going to change both the way that car companies can do their product planning function with a lot more granular data. And I think also for the supplier community, it's a great opportunity to look at a commodity that you as a supplier make, and look at the trends, and look at, and obviously we can slice this into brand performance. And so, when you as a supplier are trying to decide, am I going to add a factory to build more of these things? I've got a car company that wants me to bid on a contract for a certain volume of these things. Is this really plausible based on historical performance and future trends? Now there's the potential to be able to look at this and make better decisions on investments.
Well, I hope the people who are on our line were as amazed as I was by this set of slides and this data. It's really great and an insightful way to look at both the manufacturing and the supply and the sales channel efficiencies. The first thing I wonder is, how did we get here? Doug, you mentioned entropy, and that we start with, and even going back to the 80s or so, when we started packaging all the options, so that you'd theoretically have fewer configuration options if you had everything either had one of 5 packages. So how do we get here? And are the dealers really in the driver's seat here about pulling this complexity into the market?
As I've alluded to, I've had a lot of experience at automakers, and I remember early in my career when I was young and very ambitious and working in manufacturing, I encountered this issue. We were developing a new vehicle, and at some point in time, I realized that there were on this particular vehicle, which I won't name, there were 89,000 different configurations, again excluding color, that we were, that were on the list, and we were going to engineer and we were going to prepare the factory and the supply chain to be able to build. And that just seemed like too many to me, but I was young and naive, and so I went to talk to the product planning organization, the sales and marketing organization about it, and they agreed. They're like, oh, yeah, that's too many. We'll never sell 89,000 different versions. Everybody got a fire inside to do something about it. Long story short, we had no data from which to decide which of those 89,000 we should remove, and we eventually decided that I didn't agree with it, but we decided that we couldn't do anything about it because the launch was still 2 years away, and things could change in 2 years, and we might need some of those. So we went ahead and engineered and prepared to build, and they narrowed it down later on. Probably could have done it 2 years earlier, but they didn't narrow it down to 500. They narrowed it down to 5,000. So it still was more than the market wanted.
Do you have this data for just the US, or do you have it for other markets as well?
Matthew?
Yeah, so today the data is just for the US market. But following up on your question before, you asked about who's in the driver's seat for complexity, and just adding on to Doug's point. Today there's 16,682 dealers in the US, and I think most OEMs agree that the dealers should be left to knowing their markets best. But to kind of add on what Doug said, right? There's thousands of possible combinations of some of these vehicles. And if you look at their ordering process, the ordering process is maybe on a weekly basis, order a small batch of vehicles to sell what you sold this week. And then you wait. And then you may wait 2-3 months before those vehicles arrive, and those vehicles may take 2 or 3 months to sell. So, 5, 6, 7 months have actually have elapsed before the vehicles sell, and the dealers kind of forget that, right? They forget that sales process, that whole length of cycle. So a lot of dealers kind of take an approach to measure, hey, what are my other competitive dealers stocking in my market area, and I'm going to avoid those vehicles, and it's entirely because I don't want to compete directly with them. Others may just remember, hey, here's what I recently sold. I need to stock more of what I recently sold, and forget that it took 180 days to sell, and they took a loss on that vehicle. Or others may look at their manufacturer reports and kind of say, here's what other dealers are selling. Regardless of the approach to that, we think there's a better way to actually say, what's the data saying that the market is demanding? And the best way of looking at that is vehicles that are turning faster and that are netting dealers above average profitability really is an indicator of configurations that the market wants.
So I know I'm not alone in my roof rack that I didn't want and don't use. I surveyed some of my friends and colleagues, you know, what features are on your car that you really didn't want when you bought it, and you know, have you grown to love some of those things that you didn't want, and you know, would now value it differently, or do you still have like complete ambivalence? I wish it wasn't there, and I wish I didn't have to pay anything for that. And you know, there's a colleague with a sunroof who doesn't want a sunroof. There was a colleague who had a car that had adaptive cruise control and just was like, I don't even know what this is. This is somebody outside of the auto industry. And then they grew to love it. And why don't all cars have this? Is there something to you know, the selling of complexity that, you know, like when the dealers are facing the customer and saying, you know, they're either going to have to mark it down a little bit because the customer doesn't value it at the point, but can you think about how does that play into the profit situation, and how does it play into, you know, if I say I got this, you know, adaptive cruise control and I really love it, and I might talk to other of my friends and then they might want it, and then it starts to take off, right?
Yeah.
So you know, those changes in the market that are happening, can you see some of that in your data?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, and actually the example that Matthew talked through was adaptive cruise control, and it's a new technology, and it's pretty hard to explain it to at least to a non-engineer, you know, what it is, how it works, why they would appreciate it. You know, keyless entry was another one that came, you know, a few years ago, and at first people were like, "Oh, it's a big deal," you know, but once you had it, and you're like, "Well, I don't think I want to live without this again." So there's definitely, when it comes to new technology, and it's really sort of a different subject. It's like, how do you, for things that are new that people are not familiar with and they don't have a strong opinion about whether they want it or not, how do you introduce it to the market? How do you validate that the version of it that you've created is actually useful? You know, we do other things besides obviously what we're doing here. We're probably best known for research with customers. We have two studies, one very well known, IQS problem, you know, here's something and it's a problem. Another one we have that is, I think, also very valuable is called the appeal study. It's an acronym, but it, you know, the acronym actually kind of relates to what it is. So how much do you like your car? And, you know, here, what about this on your car, and this and this and this? You know, things like adaptive cruise control are on there. And the interesting thing is, if your friend had bought a different brand, they might actually hate the adaptive cruise control because some of them don't work as well as others. That's unfortunate but true. And so, you know, you can't necessarily, if you talk to somebody and they've got their first adaptive cruise control, they either think it's fantastic or they think it's stupid, and that's because of the way it was executed by the company that they bought it from. So, you know, those kinds of things just have to be sorted out. And I think if you're going to bet on like building a factory to make adaptive cruise control components for a company, you know, you really almost would want to have a look at, well, are they doing a good job with this, or am I betting my money on something that, you know, they just haven't done a good job on.
I think we've got a question from the audience, and it actually puts a different spin on my question. It's actually really well worded too. How predictive is this data? So if we're looking back on what's sold and how much, how well does this predict what should be built 2 to 4 years from now? Like say, have you taken 2015 to 2016 data and made a prediction without looking at 2019 to 2020 performance, and then successfully, can you predict the take rate and profit for a market or a segment?
I'll let Matthew have that one.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So from a understanding the noise, right? There's a lot of things that kind of get in the way of teasing out how content drives performance, right? Availability, component availability, competitive positioning, pricing, all the advertising, incentives, et cetera. And then you have to take a look at every month is kind of a unique set, right? It's a unique experience for that customer who shops today and looks at today's available market supply and today's incentives, right? It's not necessarily comparable to what's going to happen next month. But if we take a step back and start to say, well, let's look at the ability for us to understand adoption curves, increasing technology or safety feature adoption curves. They're increasing, but are they driving profitability? Are they driving days to turn? We're actively working through our AI models, our machine learning models, to be able to tease out all of that information and get through the noise. We're not there yet, but it's something we are aggressively chasing.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll add to that the great thing about the data that we have is it goes back 10 years. So you know, we can look at introductions of new technology that happened 5 years ago and see how they played out, and we can also look at our appeal data and other things and see how, okay, this was a introduction of something that actually people liked, and here's how it grew. Here's an introduction of something that people thought was stupid. My favorite is the lane keeping alert. It doesn't steer you back in the lane, it just beeps at you all the time. It's like having your mother-in-law riding the car with you all the time. But so we can kind of see that, and then we can talk about new technology and whether customers like it or not, and make some predictions about how that factor will play into its adoption. Obviously, we can do seasonality. Some things are more popular certain times of the year than others. Like I said, the data really is descriptive now, but we're working on making it much more predictive in the future.
We have a whole bunch of good questions coming in from this group. The next is, what on the chart where you showed the days to turn and profitability, what was the average profit for a greater than 80 day to turn versus a less than 80 day to turn? It looks from that chart as many dots above the line as under.
I don't know if you did that calculation, Matthew, or not.
For
the industry.
Unfortunately, I don't have the average in each quartile, but that's something we can definitely look into getting for you.
We've done it before. One thing to consider as well is that what we're showing here is just dealer margin. Now, obviously, cars that become 180 days old, once they start to bump into a change of model year, then you have OEMs having to step in with, we got to discount the 2019s because they got to go, because we've got to sell 2020s now. So there's a huge cost to the OEMs that is, that we can track, but it's a separate subject.
Right, to move the unicorns.
Yeah.
There are other markets that are more build to order. Do we have any idea what proportion of US vehicles are build to order versus dealer orders?
It's under 5%.
Wow, that is really, really low.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The problem with build to order in this market is, and I don't know if it's just because we're conditioned that for cars that we want to find it and we want to buy it and we drive it home. It's kind of like, you try on shoes. They try to encourage you just to wear them out of the store. In in Europe, people mostly, it's built to order, and surprisingly, I don't know if Europeans are just inherently more patient or if they're just used to that, but they order it and they wait weeks and weeks and months to get their car. One thing that I understand, I worked for a couple of Japanese companies, that at least one of the companies I worked for in Japan, you go to the dealer, they have one example of the car that you might be interested in, you order it, and then like 3 days later, you get the car that you ordered. The way they have the supply chain set up and everything about how they do that, and it's not a huge technological marvel. I've seen that done with paper, but that's how it works there. So they've kind of got the best of both worlds, and have all the costs of carrying all this inventory so that people can find a car that's close to what they want, but people don't have to wait either. So that would be ideal, but we're a long ways from being able to do that.
This is a question you may not be able to answer, but maybe on a broad scale. What is the correlation between the number of base model variants, not including the dealer installed options, by given OEM with their profitability? Can you do that kind of a cut?
So typically what we'll see is, and if I break out premium from kind of the non-premium, right, I would break it into multiple quadrants because the industry is not all the same. So premium, non-premium, and then the pickup trucks, and then everything else. I think when we look at the pickup truck market, we do see an alignment that in some cases, increased configurations does lead to higher profitability for its vehicle portfolio, compared to the non-pickup trucks within an OEM brand. So, most of the manufacturers are happy to add complexity because the profit per unit is just so high in the pickup truck market. The same thing on the luxury side of the business. Increased complexity typically leads to higher OEM profitability, though conversely, lower dealer margin that we start to see. For much of the other markets or other segments, typically more complexity is going to lead to less profitability.
Okay, so pickups and luxury, you see that leads to more profits.
Mm-hmm.
Great. What is a better way to minimize complexity into the plant and not affect the revenue of the vehicles? It says forcing consumers to use this or that feature to improve the negotiation with the supplier in large scale.
Yeah, we're getting into the world of hypotheses and opinions,
Yep.
so I'll give mine, but it's worth what you paid for it. There are some examples of companies that, without data, have decided we're not gonna deal with this complexity. My observation is that they don't offer it. Their websites offer a very limited selection of what you can configure. And then, the outcome from that is, I suppose some customers may be disappointed when they try to configure what they want, and it's just, everything is sort of packaged, and they can't weed out what they don't want, and they can't add that one thing that they'd like to have without adding other things. So there may be some unappreciated disappointment during the shopping stage, but the advantage they have is, once you have settled on a vehicle, you check the local dealer, and it's very likely that they will have that, or there will be one very nearby that you can get that's exactly what you decided you wanted. So, it's I've always lived my life by the Goldilocks and the Three Bears philosophy, which is, 3 choices is enough. Probably not for a car, but close.
We have a lot of choice in the United States. I know I have a friend who goes to the grocery store and counts just the different variants of macaroni and cheese.
Yeah.
A very simple thing.
Really cute. Yeah.
Shape of noodles, is the sauce powdered or in a can? Is it frozen? Is it shelf stable, like is the macaroni and cheese itself in a can. Like and toothpaste. We have a million different kinds of toothpaste. We like all this different choice out there. So I assume that there are there's common parts or components across a wide range of these different configurations. Are there some really low volume individual components or options out there, or super high volume ones that maybe across, there's 600 and some thousand different configurations, but you know, there are some variants that penetrate that more because of the parts commonality. So what are some examples of parts or components where you're seeing the most growth over time?
So where we're seeing growth, that's actually a couple examples I'll throw out there. One Doug touched on just a moment ago was the lane departure passive warning, right? The little indicator. I think it was a step on that you indicated, Doug. In 2001, that was 0.1% adoption rate in the industry. For 2020 model year, it's just about 68%. So significant growth over the last 12 model years. And the same thing for electronic parking brake, 1% in 2008 model year, and just short of 62% for the 2020 model year. And you asked, I think, a couple questions in terms of very low heads-up display. That's something that just has not really grabbed a significant amount of share. For 2020 model year, only 0.2% take rate on that vehicle or on that type of feature. So that, along with CD players, right, another interesting story. Darn near 100% adoption rate or take rates in the 2008, even to 2013 model year, hovering in the upper 90s. The 2020 model year, only 24%, and we're seeing a significantly lower take rate for the 2021 model year. So some features definite decline, some features are growing.
Yeah, and to speak from a factory perspective, the one that we always talk about is wire harnesses, right? Because every time you add a feature that has to be plugged in, then you've got to have a different wiring harness, and sometimes you try to find a balance and have maybe dead plugs that I just don't want to make another version. I mean, if you go to a factory and you want to go in the warehouse, you'll find a big section of wiring harnesses because that's the thing that almost always has to change. You have other features like side view mirrors that you can have, the base one that's just black, and then you got the painted one, and then you've got the chrome one, and then you've got the one with the light that tells you there's somebody in your blind spot, then you got the one with the camera, you got the self-dimming one, and then you got every combination of those. So if you're a supplier that's making those mirrors, you've got an assembly line that you have to constantly shut down and change over to make the different ones, and that costs you efficiency, and it costs you inventory space and all the costs that are associated with having all those different versions.
I think that ties right into this next question about what opportunities are there for suppliers whose parts or components are on those higher volume and higher velocity configurations. So what can they do? How do they even know that they're on them? I mean, I'm sure, their parts volumes show, and, what they're getting from when they bid on the package of parts versus, what they were able to perform during the model year. But what kind of opportunities are there for them?
I think that, I think an opportunity, if I was in a supplier's shoes, getting access to data like what we have, so that when you're either pursuing a contract, deciding on investments, or being offered a contract and looking at what you're being offered, to be able to see, something that tells you, certainly the descriptive data that we have now and trends, and so like the last chart that Matthew went over, you can see whether something is growing or not, and there's some, and even again, we can slice it by brand so that you can look and see what is the credibility of the volume that I'm being told I will get. And that, I think that should play a lot into their decisions on what they should bid based on the volume they'll get, and how they should invest and so forth. Will be a lot more visibility of that than what has been available in the past.
And are automakers using your data right now, using this data in their efforts to try to streamline production and get their sales operations in order? Because as we know, everybody is scrambling right now to get production ramped up. Eliminating some complexity here would be a good thing. It would also save some money, which is also in tight supply. So are you engaged with many automakers on using this data?
Yeah, absolutely. So we launched this solution late last year. It's now used by multiple manufacturers. We're currently under review with a large number of others. And kind of tangentially, right, we're actively in the process of working with a number of dealers to help support better ordering processes. So dealers even see that there's an opportunity to help remove the number of unicorns.
Well, that's great. I hope that filters through to suppliers. Another question is about, if you're a supplier, sometimes you have to bid on a package of parts. And I think these things are packaged together always to have some cherry parts, some really nice things that are going to be very profitable and high volume, and a few duds. And you've got to pick this whole package. How do suppliers position themselves to get on those higher volume, higher margin configurations? Like, what can they be doing and thinking about going forward to put themselves in a position to get the better, more cherries, fewer duds?
I'll speak as a former automaker that was involved in decisions on sourcing. That there's no doubt, and the personality of every automaker is different. There's no doubt that price is important, but also it's very important to think about how your relationship with the automaker. Do you have a reputation of bringing your best technology to them, and that you're going to work together well with them to make the technology work well. So because at the end of the day, car companies sell cars that people like, and the function of those cars is the sum of the parts that they're made out of. And while I gave the example of adaptive cruise that works well and doesn't work well, many times the ones that don't work well are the result of an unsuccessful collaboration between suppliers and automakers. They didn't work well together, and they made some sort of a Frankenstein that doesn't have the best thinking of either company in how to integrate that technology. So I think that's very important to be a trusted partner to get the good deals, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Doug and Matthew, this has really been very insightful. I want to thank you for joining us. If participants want to know more about how they could engage with this, how do they get in touch with you, and who do they contact?
I think Matthew's probably the best choice, since I cover a variety of areas. So, I don't know, Kristin, if at the end of this we provide some email contact information, something like that.
We can do that in the follow-up email and send out Matthew's contact.
Yeah.
So I want to thank all of our guests. Matthew, Doug, this was really insightful. And thanks to all of our participants as well. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. The recording will be available again at cargroup.org after this broadcast. And we do hope to see you on future webinars as well as the car management briefing seminars, August 4th and 5th. Thank you so very much. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Yep. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Doug. Bye, Matthew.
Bye.